Hi, Deacon Ron here. I'd like to continue my reflections on the meaning of biblical faith by looking at the story of David and Goliath. And that's what the Bible does. It doesn't focus on giving us philosophical, theological treatises on the meaning of faith. It tells us stories about people of faith, how they lived, how they acted, how they believe. And in this way, it teaches us how we should live our lives of faith. What I want you to focus on in this story of David and Goliath is that faith is an act of courage. It's an act of bravery. It's a taking a risk. It's a leaving your comfort zone. It's much more than just believing in God. All the soldiers in the Israelite army believed in God, but only one had the courage to step out and to face Goliath. So faith is very much an act of courage. In the story of David and Goliath, the Israelite army is facing off against the Philistines, their enemies. And they agree that instead of both of them fighting, the Israelites were to pick their best fighter and the Philistines were to pick their best fighter. They'd have a one-on-one battle and it was a winner-take-all. The problem was the Philistine champion, Goliath, was a monster. He was a seasoned warrior. He was huge. He was a giant. And no one in the Israelite army wanted to fight him because they thought there's no way I'm going to fight this guy because he's just impossible to beat. Anyway, one day David's father, David at this stage was a young shepherd boy, sent David, he said, look, take some food and bread to your brothers who are in the army and just see how they're going. So David goes along and he hears what's been happening. He hears that for 40 days, Goliath has been coming down and making fun of God and his army, mocking the God of the Israelites. So David said to King Saul, I'll fight him. And of course, all the other soldiers laughed. Go back and look after your sheep. You're a young boy. How are you going to fight this seasoned warrior who is a giant? You're going to get killed. This shows you that, again, faith is an act of courage. It's also an act of, it has an element about it of impossibility, of irrationality, of craziness. David was crazy enough to be prepared to fight Goliath. He was crazy enough to do what seemed to be the impossible. And on a certain level, it is crazy. It's madness. But on another level, it's very rational because the idea is, well, it's not you doing the fighting. It's God doing the fighting in you and with you. You're relying on God, and God is much bigger than any situation in which you can find yourself. So anyway, the king agrees to let David fight Goliath because he hasn't got any other option. So he gives David his armor. And let me just read to you this section from 1 Samuel, chapter 17. Saul made David put on his own armor and put a bronze helmet on his head and gave him a breastplate to wear. And over David's armor he buckled his own sword. But not being used to these things, David found he could not walk. I cannot walk with these, he said to Saul. I'm not used to them. So they took them off again. I think the point here is that David is not going to rely on his own strength, his own resources, his own power. He's going to rely on God. That's the point here. So David takes his shepherd's staff with him. He takes a pouch and he puts some stones in it and he takes his sling and he goes out to meet Goliath. And Goliath looks at David and feels insulted. He says, I'm this famous warrior and you send a little boy out to challenge me. He says to David, I'm going to feed you to the dogs. And then David replies to him. But David answered, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of Yahweh, the God of the armies of Israel, that you have dared to insult. Today Yahweh will deliver you into my hand, and I shall kill you. I will cut off your head And this very day I will give your dead body and the bodies of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that it is not by sword or by spear that Yahweh gives the victory, for Yahweh is Lord of the battle, and he will deliver you into our power. So there you go. It is not by sword or spear that Yahweh will give the victory. It is not by relying on our own power or strength that we will achieve the victory. It is through faith in Yahweh, trusting God. And he says, on this day, everyone will know that there is a God. In other words, when you rely on God and trust in him to help you win the battles in your life, you will know from experience that there is a God. Not because the Pope told you, or because I told you, because the Bible told you. You will know from your own personal experience that there is a God. So David goes out to meet the Philistines. He defeats him. He puts a rock in his sling, throws a rock at Goliath, hits Goliath in the head. Goliath falls down, and David goes and cuts off his head. What's the message here? The message, sorry, my dogs have just woken up. The message here is quite simple. How do you meet the Goliaths in your life? How do you face those huge problems that you think you cannot defeat? It could be an addiction, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, gambling, sexual addiction, shopping addiction, whatever it is. The million addictions that we are faced with in today's world. How do you defeat this impossible problem, this huge giant of a problem that you think is just impossible for you to defeat? The first thing you do, you face it. You admit to it. You go out and you look it in the eye. You challenge it. You admit that it's there. The second thing you do is you realize that you cannot defeat it using your own resources and power. You've tried, and you just cannot defeat this problem. Third thing you do, you rely on the power of God. I mean, this is pure Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's based on biblical spirituality. You rely on God to fight the battle for you. And the promise of the Bible is you can defeat the Goliaths in your life. You can do the impossible. It's not going to be easy. It's not a simplistic, just believe in God and your problem will go away. No, that's not going to happen. It involves struggle. It involves prayer. It involves great effort. It involves talking to people, having others help you. But in the end, the promise of the Bible is that you will defeat the Goliaths in your life, those huge problems that face you. This is the biblical promise. This is the meaning of faith. Thank you for listening.